Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome to Web3 Warriors, episode 70, featuring Tipi, an Oji Cree Anishinaabe, lens-based and digital artist, and an amazing leader in this Web3 space who has been hosting awesome conversations since I met her back in 2021, and really inspiring conversations about the power of Web3 and NFTs. Welcome, Tipi. How are you doing? Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, good evening. I'm doing good. It's nice and sunny in Manitoba, as you would know.
That's another thing I can't forget to mention, a fellow Manitoban joining us from Gimli, just a little bit north of me here in Winnipeg. Appreciate you being here, and it is nice and sunny, and it's been summertime, our short-lived summers we always try to take advantage of. I'm glad you're doing well.
Yeah. Lake country. All the lawnmowers are going right now.
Oh, nice. Well, we can't hear them, so that's good.
Yeah, I'm trying. I have all the windows closed. But anyways, yeah, all good here.
Good
How's
stuff.
it going with you?
Awesome.
Excited?
It's going well here. Excited to have this conversation and learn more about your story, as I know it's very inspiring from what I do know already, but I look forward to really having a deep dive and hearing more about your Web3 journey. Thank you, everybody, again for joining us. This is Web3 Warriors. I'm your host, David Krome. Go by Krome in the metaverse. And as always, we are pushing the Web3 space forward and really just trying to talk to creators and builders in the space and focus on the technology, on the culture, on the real optimistic kind of potential of the Web3 space, and less about the FOMO, less about, getting rich overnight and all these other things that you tend to hear about when thinking about NFTs and crypto. But really the potential is in the technology. So what we're going to be focusing on today, and we have Tipi here to really explain this from a very kind of impactful perspective, I think. And it's been a recurring theme on this show, which is really the potential for culture to be preserved as well as promoted and also protected on the blockchain, because these NFTs are immutable, because people do have their own kind of sovereign right to tell their story and share their art in a way that kind of resonates with them. And once it's on the blockchain, nobody can take it away, right? So that's why it is a powerful tool to promote, preserve, and protect culture, I believe. And we've seen this through a few interviews that we've had on the show. So we have Kofi's African masks, where he's really preserving the culture of, the African masks that have been kind of made taboo in a lot of corners of the world, but actually have a really beautiful story to tell. We've talked to Zion with his Afrocentric mandala style, really highlighting the beauty of the African culture and some of their artworks. We also spoke to Brown Eagle, who I think was our only other fellow Manitoban that I've had on the show so far, who's looking at kind of the finance side of crypto, and his project is Decolonized Capital, which is looking to help empower, reserve communities and indigenous communities with the use of cryptocurrency, and really being able to kind of detach themselves potentially from some of the more oppressive tactics of the banking industry and really the government more broadly. So those are just a few projects that we've talked to on the show and really highlighted the impactful potential for NFTs and Web3 and blockchain to really empower, cultural, like taking back your culture really, and really giving people the opportunity to share their stories and to really proclaim their culture in a way that resonates with them and is not necessarily told by gatekeepers or the most popular people with a platform, right? So that's what we're going to get into today, and I really know that TP is the best guest we can have to have a kind of full conversation about that, so really looking forward to that. And as I mentioned, the rooms that you've hosted, TP, have been very inspiring when I am able to get into there. It's always been a very global, eclectic, kind of multicultural group of people that you've attracted, and really it inspired me, if I'm being quite honest, hearing a fellow Manitoban having these awesome huge rooms with multicultural global audiences was definitely a part of the inspiration behind this podcast, really, and really just taking the initiative to host my own clubhouse spaces and to try to push the space forward in my own way. So thank you for that, TP, and thank you for joining. And without any further ado, maybe we can start with a bit of a background on yourself. I'd love to hear, what brought you to Web3 and NFTs, and maybe a little bit of the story behind Tipi, the artist name, or your handle NFTP, which has become ubiquitous and is really impressive. So thanks for joining. Maybe if you could start with a bit of a story behind, what brought you to Web3.
Oh my gosh, my head is spinning in every direction trying to think, where do I start? I think the best place to start would be Clubhouse, because there was a set of circumstances that brought me there to begin with, which was I am part of the class action suit against the government of Canada as a 60 scoop survivor. And there was monies that were being paid out to claimants. And as an eligible claimant, I was anticipating being sent some of the monies in that class action. And so for me, I was really trying to figure out what I would do and how best to utilize that money in a way that would have some longevity for my children. And so I was looking at investing. And I spent a little bit of time before I came into Web3, really understanding ESGs and kind of looking at what is ESG. I was looking to buy with startup companies that are looking to as green investments. And I don't want to virtue signal in any way because I can never speak to whether or not, somebody's goal, they're meeting their goals or not. But I was trying to figure this all out. So for me, I was just trying to figure out, do I invest in startup companies or do I invest in companies that are already established a long history of really being able to provide for their shareholders and have growth for their shareholders? And are they meeting the kind of standards that I would like to see as part of sustainability goals, which are not limited just to what they're doing with climate change and sustainability and green, but also what they're doing. For me, sustainability also means what are you doing to represent the community and be responsive to community members. And so that's number one for me. So ESG was one of those abilities to have a ranking system for shareholders. And so I looked at that and I was like, well, you can either go with a startup, so you're just investing anew, or you're going to look at doing insider activism. And to me, as a little OG punk rocker, I was like, I'm going to be insider activist, meaning you can look at the rating system. And so that would, I'll give an example, and then I'll explain how that got me into Clubhouse. But an example of an ESG rating system would be if you're going to rate, say, Domino's Pizza. Domino's Pizza is does it have are they driving green cars and they're not driving green cars? Are they do they have a good diversity in their employee pool? Are they responsive to employee complaints? Do they have a lot of complaints against them, et cetera, et cetera? So there's a whole range of issues there that you would address, not just whether or not their people are the company is doing carbon sinks or carbon offsets. So. I think there's like a lot of polarity. People think that a company is very focused on ecology and sustainability, and I just think it's a very narrow narrative. And
For sure.
So I always look at a little askance at some of the things that people are making statements of, and I'm like, So anyway, so that was before I came in. I was just really trying to understand that. And so my eldest daughter, was telling me about Clubhouse, and she said, this is it was just Christmas time 2021, so we're in COVID times and still kind of dealing with lockdown. And she said, Mom, there's a lot of different kinds of conversations there. And so she had invited me to Clubhouse, and I spent some time looking and investing and different sustainability. But I've also been very involved in art and tech through my own professional life and personal life. So those are the kind of categories I looked at. And I ended up in some different film rooms because I'm also work for the Directors Guild of Canada. Oh my God, there's just a million things that I do. But
quite the resume.
So I was in a Clubhouse, and I went into a couple of rooms. And they were massive, massive rooms. Ed, those two brothers, Kransteins, I think they're.
Yeah, the Krasensteins.
Krasensteins, yes, I was in there. So I was like, there's just no way to have a conversation about, I want to talk about this. I was listening to it for a couple of weeks and listening to those rooms. And then I hadn't actually connected with a whole bunch of people yet. I was just listening. I was really shy to speak. Speaking of which, I apologize to anybody that's wondering why I'm not live. If you know anything about Northern Indigenous communities, you're lucky you even have me on the phone.
No worries, no issues. You're not the first guest to not want to go live on camera. It's no problem.
Yeah. So back to that time though in Clubhouse, it was primarily that there was people, I was sure people like me that wanted to talk about art, that had questions, that wanted to connect.
Mm.
And I realized a lot of people were learning just as I was. So I started hosting my own club, my own space, my own club rooms. And I noticed that people were coming in and saying that they were artists. They like everybody's idea of an artist is somebody that paints and that's it. It's like I'm an artist, and at that time that's really what it was. And I felt really bad for them. And I said, everybody is an artist. It's whether what are you channeling? Like what are you doing? And so I've had these conversations many times outside in real life when I had an artist co-op. So I've had a lot of people. There seems to be like a lot of confusion on how we define ourselves as artists. So I named the club the Creators Co-op. Because I say we're all creators. And I described it like when we're in a film set or we're working on a film production. You know, there's pre-production, production, and post-production. There's marketing. There's so many moving parts. And all of those people are creatives in some way, including like craft services, which is food, accountants, everything. There's just so many moving parts to the creative industry. So I created the Creators Co-op, trying to be inclusive. Literally, that was my goal, multimedia. And so I spent a lot of time in Clubhouse. That was the number one thing for me. At that time, there was a lot of Asian hate going on. And for me, I wanted to be responsive to that. And some of the first NFTs I ever shared were from Asian artists. And there wasn't a lot of separation in Clubhouse yet about different clubs. There was just a lot of general rooms, like just NFTs. What's an NFT? And what is that? What is crypto? And so the Creators Co-op, I would run, I think the first session was probably 130 days straight between 8 to 12-hour rooms. And I was like delirious by the end of it. I reemerged. It was Mother's Day. It was like, holy moly. Yeah. So it was just a lot of different rooms with multilingual communities. And I would just have people that, I'd say, come on up. And it was just everything in its time, that mentality. There was no rush. Yeah. It was everything in its time. And so people would just come in and hang out. And that's one of the stories that I hear the most, is that they would wait for like 6 hours to speak and they would be listening and stuff. And I just thought that's crazy. So that was my intro to the community, was just letting people talk in a very mindful and considerate way, and trying to understand more about NFTs and diversity in that space. I was already advocating for multi-chain from the very beginning, as somebody that started on Wax. Was looking at a theory,
Wax,
advocating for Tezos. During that time, all three of them were the entirety of the conversation. So, and then there was a lot of branching out afterwards to Tezos rooms or things like that. But the co-op was completely multi-chain, multilingual, and multimedia.
And so how did the kind of technological, because you didn't know about Web3 and NFTs kind of prior to that time on Clubhouse, right? So how did the tech side of those creative co-op kind of rooms evolve, right? Because ultimately I think onboarded a lot of people, right? Like there were people that maybe resonated with the creator side of it, but didn't quite understand the NFT side of it, right? And so were you kind of learning right alongside with all the other creatives, and maybe you got a developer in the room, or you had some NFT advocate who could, break it down more from a technical perspective? How did that kind of onboarding conversation go?
I've always been into tech. I've always been somebody that, I can't even remember the word. Ever since I heard the word, I forgot the word, but it's somebody that's a self-learner. Okay. And I can't remember. So somebody knows it, just text me so I know what it is. I can put it in my bio. But I really believe in self-learning. I'm one of those people that people call all the time for help, because I teach children. I've been in the education system as a teacher. I ran after school. I'm one of those people that's responsive to community. I see what community needs, and then if you build it for them, and then leave it for somebody else to take care of afterwards. So teaching children has helped me understand a lot about what is the very basics that people need. And all of it usually has to do with having proper resources. So you can, and also time. You give people time, and that that moment to say, here, check this out, but if you message me if you have any questions. And for some reason, it's that encouragement in itself that gets people to follow through with it. They'll actually watch it. I think if people stay in that state of confusion, they don't go forward, right? They're stuck there in this little mini cycle of, I can't do it. And if I can, just let me know how you're doing.
And you get discouraged, right? And you get discouraged and you just leave. So having someone like you who's just very open and there for assistance, and if you don't know the answer, you'll reach out to someone else who knows the answer. And your network was huge, right? Like it grew quite substantially. So it's really awesome that worked out the way it did for you. I love that you mentioned kind of right off the bat that it was about trying to find investment. The 60 Scoop situation is, one of many sad parts of our history, and it's good that there is some kind of rectifying that has been attempted or being worked on, for sure. And you mentioned ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance standards, right? And I love that, you have money that you want to invest, and you were looking at that angle of things, because I think too much in the space broadly, in the investor space really, you hear people like Elon Musk and others basically writing off ESG as some bureaucratic nonsense that doesn't matter. But we do have actual investors like yourself, and I'd fall into this category as well, that care about the ESG standards of a company that they want to invest in. And I think that the fact that, you went into investing with that lens is awesome. And it's always good to hear that actually exists. It's not all just like government saying, oh, you must do this, that, or the next thing. Like, no, there's actual real world impacts. And in a past life, not too long ago, I was in the corporate world and I actually worked directly on ESG. And yes, there is, to your other point about virtue signaling and a lot of like empty kind of like paper promises, right? There is some of that for sure. But ultimately, actual change has to happen as well. And without tracking that change and actually advocating for that change, it doesn't happen, as we've seen. So I just love that you brought that up. So what have been kind of some of the challenges around having that lens and really moving in this space that you've encountered, and how do you feel about it from an investment standpoint? Like, did you find the investments you were looking for, or you just kind of jumped into NFTs and went that direction? So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Well, it's interesting. What ended up happening was really understanding a little bit more about the artist community. So I stayed for the art, quite honestly, and the humanity, the people behind the artwork, which was really, really important to me. When we look at ESGs, and we look at that kind of tie into NFTs and crypto, and we look at investments, I was thinking a lot about how that we incorporate the ideology of like having voter rights, and you see that evolving with DAOs and different things. And those were conversations that because I had an interest, I all of a sudden had a say. Like I had an interest in what are artist platforms doing? Like what are they doing? What are their goals? What about sanctions? What does international mean? What about regulations? How does it all tie together? How do regulations with carbon offsets work? What are the governments and regulations and whether or not those are actually international? So when any organization or any DAO or any business is making claims, how are we able to track that? And do artists care about that? And artists should care about that if they're going to be utilizing that platform. I think there are platforms that have, come, like they arrived, they plateaued, and they left. Right. So whatever happened to all of that investment material, all the monies that went to that, all the claims that went along with that? What happened to the artists that were behind that are still there? And so to me, there's a lot of reasons why artists should care. And it's a lot to unpack for somebody that's completely was just an artist. And when I say just, not to minimize the role of the artist, the platforms are here, and the artists, and they survive because of the artists and the creatives, right?
For sure.
So I don't mean to minimize that at all. I mean, I'm just saying the artist came in just as an artist. They didn't come in as an investor. They didn't come in as a business manager. They didn't come in as a social media manager. They came in with the hope of finding the right opportunity opportunity and the right match for them to get their artwork seen in the right way and the right promotion and the right sustainability for the artists themselves. And is it just it's not just going to be 1 year in the bear market or the bull market, and then we go into the bear market and everybody just falls off the planet, right? So
it's a big part of it seems. Unfortunately.
Well, and what I see in this space, and because the question ultimately was, what do I see some of the challenges are? And I would say the biggest challenge is like, there's a lot of emotion that comes a lot with this, a lot that goes with finances, a lot that goes with artists. And the most sensitive souls are artists, because we're transmitting our insides to our outsides, which is really how I look at it. I described it that way because it's true.
That's beautiful.
This is what we're doing. So when we do that, we're extremely vulnerable. And so when we see something not moving, or we experience that, that's a true feeling. And the output is going to, like, we're going to feel like we're dead in the water. We're going to feel like we're not seen. And it's kind of hard. I can't even imagine other people's experiences. But for me, it's been a challenge because I've had many, many hardships, and we could talk about some of the TRC afterwards, but I've had many hardships. And so for me, my response to this space is to really minimize a lot of the negativity I see, and really understand that it has nothing to do with me. That negativity has to do with the person that's putting it out. Like, that is really, they're putting their insides on their outsides too, and that person is hurting, obviously. And I think financially, we have that weird crux, that weird intersection between extreme artist vulnerability and the fragility of economics.
The reality of the hustle, right?
Yeah. And so there's like, the artists don't want to necessarily do that. I don't want to. I've mentioned to you personally that, I would need an accountant to figure some stuff out. Right. I'm an emotional person. I'm like, I would respond. I would take less. I would give somebody everything I have before I would worry about that. That's part of our Indigenous way as well. Like, our teachings are about kinship, right? Our first teaching is kinship. And how are we all connected to each other? So kindness and compassion is the number one thing. So you start throwing some numbers and hard numbers in there. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah. No, and I love that. I love that you bring the Indigenous teachings into it. And I think that's been something that's been recurring since the first time I joined you in one of your rooms. And, I love that the way that the Indigenous teachings kind of influence your outreach to the whole Web3 community, and really, I think bring a kind of healing in some ways, right? Or at very least, like, kind of a kind of safety. We've spoken to Sheila Darcy, who's got the healing coin. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She's done a lot kind of on the West Coast, and also speaks to the power of art to heal, right? And the idea that, like you just mentioned, you're vulnerable. I love the way you put it, taking your insides and putting them on the outside, really, and showing them to people in ways that can be very impactful and powerful. But ultimately, when you put it out there, you are very vulnerable. And if it isn't bought, if it isn't, retweeted, and people don't acknowledge it, I can imagine, there's a certain feeling of, a daunting feeling of, oh, was I not good enough, or is this not, why isn't this being seen, So yeah, I think you just wrapped up a lot of really important points there. So on the Indigenous side of it, right, and I do have your beautiful tipi-fi NFTs on Object right now on the screen as we're chatting. So very cool. Anyone can check that out on the video. But how is your Indigenous teachings, your culture, kind of influencing your movement in Web3? Now, obviously, your art directly, comes from that background that you have. But could you just speak to maybe the influences more broadly and how it's helping you kind of navigate Web3?
I would say from the very beginning of my journey, so just to kind of tie in the last point to this point here, yesterday I created a piece and it's not everything is for sale. So I really do feel like it's really important for me to be responsive to what I see in the community. So there was a lot of really negative kind of community output yesterday, people pointing fingers at other people. And it seems to be every week there's something anyways, right? Yeah. So it's a normal ecosystem, which is like any community. It's a community, and community has ups and downs. But for me, I saw something and it really makes me sad sometimes when I see really negative things. Again, it comes to my teachings about kind of being honorable and kinship, right?
Mm.
And so compassion comes. And I do know Sheila Darcy very well in the space, and also I'm a Heel coin holder.
Nice.
And so a part of that community. So art is healing. And even just yesterday, the piece that I created, I like to share music, and sometimes I find music that I want to share and then I create a piece with it. But yesterday I felt like be kind and be brave was my message. And so I made a piece called Be Kind and Be Brave. It was just literally a response to what I think people need to see and hear. And quite often, like on my Twitter timeline, I have a pretty good following on my Twitter timeline.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking to me. But that's where I see a lot of things. And so, because it's all words, that's where the words happen, right? So you can certainly see people send out messages of all kinds, which is to be expected. In it's a global community. And I think people in Web3 forget everybody on the planet can see that forever and ever more.
Yep.
Like that you're putting your insides on your outsides again. And is it a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. So kindness and compassion was the point about that. Be kind, be brave. What was the original question? Sorry,
just the Indigenous teachings influencing your navigating Web3.
Oh yes, okay. So be kind, be brave. So the first times I decided to speak, this is really important, and I treat people a lot like this in the space. We have a lot of different kinds of teachings. One of the things, I think the third teaching is about humility. And one of my favorite teachings, or my favorite sayings, this is not necessarily a teaching, but one of my favorite sayings an elder shared with me is, we're all walking the sharp edge of the knife between humility and pride. And so sometimes I think that gets lost in a space where, the loudest voices are heard. And so it's a challenge for people that are maybe neurodivergent. I am one that's neurodivergent. And so for me to talk, like literally before I was talking to you and we're in that few minute waiting period before you were doing the transition to the Twitch. I was literally having an anxiety attack. My whole heart was fluttering. No. Like I thought I was going to pass out. So like, I always think every moment is like, you're jumping off a diving board. And that's the be brave part. And I've had to do that a number of times in the space in Clubhouse. The very first times I ever spoke were because there was a lot of signaling and a lot of stereotypes of Indigenous. And that was one of to answer your question. And so I'm like, why are you talking about Indigenous people while there's Indigenous people in the room? Like, why wouldn't you invite an Indigenous person to speak on that instead of speaking about it? Which is really, as a Bear Clan woman, I have a lot to share. I'm an environmental science graduate with the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. I've taken art history at the University of Manitoba, looking at arts and cultural appropriation and repatriation of sacred artifacts and things. I have a lot to say.
Amazing.
So you have to be brave to go up and say that and not be angry. And people ask, how come you're not more angry? And I'm like, because I value my teachings. My mother was a Medewan elder, bringing sundance ceremonies back to our northern communities. And there's a lot to be angry about, but we can't function that way. It's actually a dismantling of what connects us and the strength, right? So there's my experience is that we need to be responsive. We need to raise our hands. We need to, even before we raise our hands, we should be invited. And quite often it's 31 months I've been in NFTs and crypto, that it's very rare to be invited into the conversation, but it's quite often that I have to raise my hand. So I did so again yesterday. And this is, again, the be kind and be brave. They were talking about it. Trevor Jones, who was in a Twitter space yesterday, and they were talking about AI and culture. And And again, it's so easy to go into any room where they're talking about culture and look at the people that are on the stage. And I guarantee you there's not a lot of people that are representing culture up there. So I was like, oh, raise your hand. I would never. I was like terrified, and I did. And I spoke about culture, about Indigenous culture. I talked about stereotypes, which is massively important to me. I said, and this answers your question. One of the first questions first responses I ever had to Web3 conversation was they were talking about NFTs in a big room, and they were talking about ceremonies, and they were talking about shamanism, and they were talking about what's the drugs that they take for those?
Peyote.
Not peyote, and the other one. I can't remember the other one. Ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, I don't know anything about that. But everybody seems to always talk about that. And they think that the Indigenous folks wearing feather headdresses are all running around stoned out of their tree. And I was like, do you know that none of the ceremonies I've ever seen or participated in have ever involved anything like that? As a matter of fact, the Medewan teachings are completely the polar opposite of that. We can't even have honey. We're fasts. We do flesh offerings. We do a physical experience and ceremony that's completely through fasting and having nothing in our bodies at all other than our own organic material. And I think it's important to stand up and say, not all Indigenous communities look like this. We don't act like that. And stop assuming that we're all the same. So you have to use your voice. You have to be kind about it, and you have to be brave about it. And so I think that's been my Indigenous experience, is like really to stand up and say something, because if you're not going to get asked. That's really what it is.
Yeah. You raised so many important points there. And you're talking about being Bear Clan woman, and you really, you're so strong in your culture. It's really amazing and inspiring. Kind of getting goosebumps here. But looking at the potential, and I think it's that whole new wave or new age, I think is what they call it, right? This kind of wave of shamanism and experimenting with ayahuasca or mushrooms and this and that. And sure, you could point to a certain very specific Indigenous culture that may or may not, have done that. But I do think that in this space, and on the topic of culture and on the topic of ceremony especially, which is sacred and really should only be coming from people who genuinely practice the ceremony and whose culture actually comes from that ceremony, as far as I'm concerned. But to your point, a lot of people who have just adopted that culture or adopted those ceremonies like to speak on it as if they are an authority. So good for you for taking that brave step to, speak to the importance of your cultural traditions and the fact that many Indigenous cultures do not participate in kind of intoxication of that kind. So really important points. I know you also did want to mention or kind of look at the truth and reconciliation side of this, and I think it's an important conversation as well, right? Because I think there's a lot of maybe potentially ways that Web3 and NFTs could actually empower society, if not government, to maybe act on some of the truth and reconciliation recommendations. I'd love to hear your perspectives on that, and what are we falling short on, and where have you seen positive momentum, and how can we be part of the TRC change that's needed?
Well, I don't want to get too heavily into the truth and reconciliation because it's very, very broad scope. There's a lot of impact there. I wanted to tie it into some of the stuff that I've done with Web3, specifically with just I think people, we've talked about investing, we've talked about art, but we haven't really seen the utilization of blockchain to be another network, like a news network, where things are happening daily. How people used to have newspapers, and now we have archival newspapers. That was it. We don't have yet the archival use of blockchain technology. And so one of the things that I've done, the very first piece that I minted on Foundation was my Genesis TP. And I'll get into why TP to begin with. But the Genesis TP was, I minted, it was really important to me. And it was June 1st, 2021. And it was a photograph of a teepee that I took. And it was, it was an homage to my mom, who is a residential school survivor, which is one of the points of the Truth and Reconciliation. And she's passed away. But the journey for her was really hard, and a lot of the elders and my elder communities. And during that time, June was Canada Day in 2021, and all our flags were at half-mast in Canada still. They had been for months. And without getting into all the details there, it says a lot, if anybody is listening, to think of your entire country, a massive country like Canada, to have the flags at half-mast for months. And then on Canada Day, all the ceremonies were halted. There was nothing happening because there were children's bodies that were dug up in residential schools in Kamloops in British Columbia. And since then, there's been more bodies that have been found. And I was listening to a number of different elder stories about their experience in residential school, and it's a really traumatic experience for many of us. And those are our elders. I'm second generation residential school survivor, and I'm Gen X. I'm not a young person, so my experience is very, very tied to what happened. But it pushes me to acknowledge the second point of the Truth and Reconciliation, which is the 60 scoop, which I mentioned. I was on the class action.
Mm-hmm.
I was adopted out of my family. So there was a whole goal of, without getting into like really inflammatory vernacular, there was a goal for genocide. And we weren't allowed to use our languages. We were forced into non-Indigenous homes. And that was our life experience. And so the class action suit is really acknowledging the impacts of that. And for a lot of us, for the second generation 60 scoop the second generation residential school survivors, we were 60 scoop survivors. And that meant we lost our language. It was forced upon us. Our families, our parents children were put into schools. They weren't allowed to speak their language. They weren't allowed to practice their ceremonies. There's a lot to unpack there. So 60 scoop, myself, I was adopted out. There was a lot of impacts for my family. My eldest sister was adopted to the United States into a very religious family. She ended up killing herself.
Oh my gosh.
My twin sister is a missing murdered Indigenous woman. She was murdered, and they came to my house on our birthday to tell me that she was murdered. There's a lot to unpack in the experiences of the children of those children that were in residential schools, because they didn't know how to parent. They weren't loved. They didn't know how to parent. And so this generation, my generation, had a lot. And so there's a lot of impacts in the community. The third point for the Truth and Reconciliation is high incarceration rates. Actually, that's the fourth one. And missing murder Indigenous is the third one. And so you imagine all those children and the generational impact from near cultural genocide. It resulted in the last impact, which is high incarceration rates of substance abuse, and all the offshoots of that. So that's what the Truth and Reconciliation is, addressing those four areas: residential school survivors, 60 scoop survivors, missing murder Indigenous women, children, and I can't remember the whole MMIW, women and girls, and Two-Spirit. And then high incarceration rates. I've never been to jail, but maybe.
No.
You keep pushing me, and I'll hit all four of those areas.
Geez. Well, thank you so much for sharing your family history. That is sad. I'm very sorry that that's happened, and it's really, to your point, it's like you say, across Canada, an issue that needs to be grappled with and rectified to the extent that we can. Every individual Canadian, I think, and really humans worldwide. And you've talked about this, I think, at another time, about how you seem to get more empathy and engagement and understanding, for your plight, or for the plight of Indigenous Canadians or Indigenous North Americans in general from the audience outside of North America, right? And I think that's just really sad, unfortunately. And I feel like we need more conversations about this. The fact, like you just kind of laid out so perfectly, how the multi-generational impact trickled down to today. And and I have your first NFT on Foundation up on the screen now. It's a beautiful picture of the TP in the forest. It looks, it's very serene and kind of powerful. And I think it speaks to the importance of culture on the blockchain, like you said, and that was the reason you put that on there. And the few pieces that I have minted also generally are kind of timestamps to me. And I think one of my first was actually that same year on the Canada Day, and it was speaking to the history of colonialization. And I believe that was the same year that they knocked down the statue of the Queen at the Legislative Building, which I found to be a very kind of powerful symbolic statement. They were very frustrated, and it led to this kind of scenario where, of course, we don't, condone acts of vandalism or anything like that, but it was very clear that it was all of the pent-up emotion and frustration from the finding of these bodies, from the way that missing and murdered Indigenous women had been treated, until recently, trying to push back on the idea that it's all connected. And yeah, it's just a whole lot. And thank you for sharing and bringing that up. I think it's very important. And I do see the potential, like you say, you brought up the idea of a blockchain news network. I think we got to coin that if it's not already. That's an amazing idea, but I love the idea of using blockchain to tell these stories that need to be told, and knowing that nobody can censor you, knowing that, people, you can just point people towards your NFT and it can tell that story, So here's hoping that becomes more of a commonplace thing to do, and that, putting impactful and necessary stories and culturally profound, pieces in time on the blockchain can have the desired effect of really pushing society forward, right? Speaking to social sustainability, like you said, it's not all about environmental sustainability and carbon taxes or credits and all this. The social sustainability, finding a way to create more opportunities for Indigenous communities, for impacted communities, is everything, And so when I hear people trying to push off sustainability or even ESG, I think it's important to bring it back to actual cultural, real world, grassroots impact. And I do believe, and I know that Web3 and NFTs can have a huge role to play in this, in making this more commonplace. And we spoke to Raven Dave, who's all, he's banging that drum of sustainability often, and has some really cool sustainability connected projects. They're looking more on like the ocean, cleaning the oceans and things like that. But to your point about the social sustainability, I think there's a lot of avenues for real social change on the blockchain. So without diving too much further into that, I just want to thank you again for, sharing your story and really calling on people to take blockchain into your own hands, I think, and really use it for profound storytelling, or not even stories, but actual, factual things that happen in time, and share that story so that it cannot be lost, And on the topic of languages, because I know you just mentioned how, during the 60s scoop, during the residential schools, they were basically culturally genocide, like trying to take away the culture and destroy the culture. So that's why I agree with the term cultural genocide for sure. There's no question that that's what they were trying to do, right? So when you look at the language and you look at the ability, we have slowly seen elders teaching, the seventh generation or this generation that's coming up, the languages, and trying to make sure we can preserve them. Do you think that blockchain and Web3 can play an important role in preserving these languages that are at risk of being lost?
Well, just one thing that I'd like to say before we go to that was just back to the journalism aspect, because I think it's important to understand the healing journey is really important. So acknowledging something, I think is the most interactive and responsible way that people can connect with each other. So the Pope came to Canada and offered an apology, and on that date, I put up a video on Zora, which is, I think it's really creative to me. And it's some things I don't think about things. They just happen the way they are. They just kind of appear. So there was a video I have of teepee, and I'm doing a panning teepee. It's a beautiful spring day. And there is this sound. It almost sounds like a church bell. So I did this little small video, and I put that on Zora, and on this day, it's called On This Day, and it's a quote from the direct quote from the Pope apologizing for the sense of responsibility with regard to the priests and the nuns that had their share, that were running those residential schools. And so that apology came, and it's not really something you can put a price on, right? It just needs to be said. You need to acknowledge it. And so I acknowledged it on the blockchain. And it's interesting because it's not something I can tweet. It's not something, and it's really interesting because originally a lot of the questions are like, do people actually want to hear about Indigenous truth, the truth of our experience? And I think there's a lot of shame, and there is other people. It's really interesting. People in this space will often speak about the Indigenous story. They'll photograph it, they'll tell it. But one of the things I've said from the very beginning is we tell our own stories. And I'm tired of having other people tell our stories and using that to prop up like that there's some meritorious credit to their good-naturedness. We have our own stories. Instead of utilizing that, I think there should be more emphasis on people lifting up and holding space for those individuals and inviting people to be part of the conversation. And I just don't see that yet. And it's really, speaks volumes about the need for social change. It speaks volumes about Canada, and it speaks volumes about the Americans that actually, I'm going to say it because it makes me upset. Because you did ask me, and I did have a conversation where I said, I'm actually celebrated outside of North America more than I am in Canada and the United States. I see a lot more emphasis on diversity in Canada and United States that excludes the original peoples. It doesn't, the original peoples of United States and Canada, especially in the north of United States and the north of Canada here, all of Canada, excludes the Indigenous original peoples. And I see it repeatedly over and over and over again. And if you take a close look at it, you will as well. So I find that extremely frustrating to be celebrated by Asian communities, to be celebrated by European communities, to be celebrated by, even Latin American communities, more so than I do by, people that are intelligent, up to date on social issues and things like that still exclude the Indigenous First Nations of Turtle Island. And that's a fact. You can spend all day in a Twitter space and you'll see, especially go to a green space, go to somewhere where somebody's talking about refi. You know how many times they talk about Indigenous communities? Well,
meanwhile, having no Indigenous person on their stage.
Why are we creating more refi spaces, disseminating and dispersing the resources when there's actually, so this is really, really important because you can talk about all of the different options that we have, right? Like as far as, what we're going to do for sustainability, you can talk about those. But if you looked at my Twitter profile, it says up there that I am an advocate for changing cultural biases in data, tech, and science. And what I mean by that is in science. I went as an environmental science graduate going through all the same courses. So I need to explain this so people understand. It wasn't a course that was dumbed down for Indigenous folks. It was actually triple the course for regular folks took. So it was a course of environmental science through University of Manitoba. And it was through the Assembly of First Nations in Canada. And so we were required to take a regular course, say biophysical impact assessment, right? Great course. So you take that, and then we had a Western science, a man or woman that went through the Western science that didn't have any Indigenous self-identity, right? They went through the course. They didn't identify in any ways Indigenous. Then we had an Indigenous professor that went through the whole course that was identifying as an Indigenous person. And then we had an elder. And the courses and there was 3 courses and 3 exams for every single course through that whole entire environmental science curriculum. So we had 3 exams. It was massive, a lot of learning. And a lot of the time we actually were on site and away from home for weeks at a time. So, because we went to like ELA, Experimental Lakes area, and things like that. We went to the tar sands, which was really something that stuck in my mind. So the whole point was that we experienced understanding environmental impacts. What are proponents doing? What are the impacts? But for me, there was also understanding policy, understanding what are the regulations, what are the metrics, what is the data that we're collecting, right? So my focus was on traditional environmental knowledge, meaning I really wanted to understand what is the knowledge of the people of the land. Because you can create data, what's safe and what's not, but based on what? What's your baseline? So understanding scientific baseline is really important. Understanding data points and baseline is really, really massively important. And pretty much anything in any conversation, in anything, anywhere, people just don't really understand it, but it is. What are you basing your information on?
Yeah.
So traditional knowledge, when we want to get into conversations about eco, sustainability, greens, you want to talk about anything like that, understanding what is your true baseline. The true baseline for me, I have to say, is understanding and collecting information from the original peoples there, because they're the ones that would know what it was like and what's changed. So it's not meant to replace scientific baseline studies, because we still need those. Mm-hmm. What it's meant is for us to have a pinpoint understand if something is toxic, it's toxic. You know, you can say, they could say, it's interesting that we're here and we're doing water quality. I did my study was on water quality assessment through traditional environmental knowledge in the tar sands. So it's deemed safe there. But the Indigenous folks that have been there for thousands of years are saying, isn't it interesting that we have cancerous fish when we go fishing now? We have cancerous children. We are developing cancer in our communities, but the data is saying, the scientific data is saying the levels are safe, but at what cost? And so the point is that we have to understand that over 100 years of impact, it takes 100 years for you to know
that's crazy.
that there's a problem, right?
And who's defining safe, right? Quote unquote safe,
So anyways, my point is that those Indigenous communities understanding, and those communities aren't going to just talk to anybody, right? We have to understand that they need community members. So you need Indigenous communities representing Indigenous communities, not non-Indigenous communities representing Indigenous communities. And that's a very simple, basic fact. It's an honoring and it's a recognition, and it's also elevating and urging Indigenous communities that have been hugely impacted to pursue post-secondary education. And it's absolutely essential that we elevate our community so much that we have a lot more representation of post-secondary Indigenous graduates. And that's my goal of really trying to. There is much more that we can do when we talk about what are we doing with sustainability. We need those voices to succeed. We need them present, and we need them to be reaching the professional standards with total support. And that's what Canada needs to do, and any community does. The other thing that I'd like to say as far as international community is, it's not just about it. I can only speak from my own experience, but there are people that have their own experiences. I have friends that are in Asia. There's, understanding even just projects that are bringing forth information. There was, I was minted part of the Korea. I can't remember the term. I'm so bad with right now, but it just occurred to me. And they were talking about they minted a series for South Korea, who was also colonialized and impacted, and that there was a date. And so understanding that the experiences around the world, in Iran, our friends in Ukraine, we need to be responsive as much as we do, as much as we say that we're going to carbon offset. What about being responsive to communities in crises because of the environment? That has to be of equal measure, if not. And I would say, and I said this as far as any goals that I would have as a sustainability officer would be that what are we doing to be responsive to environmental impact that are currently in crises? That's something that any community project should do. So anyways, I think I'm rambling now.
No, it's amazing. And I think the environmental impacts, but then also social impacts, right? Like you just mentioned Iran and Ukraine, which are two examples where, it's a mess, right? Unfortunately. And when you say our friends in Iran and Ukraine and South Korea, like these are people you genuinely talk to probably like a weekly basis, right? Like this is the thing about Web3 and the global space. You know, we have the opportunity, like if we hear from an artist who's in Ukraine struggling, their community's being bombed, and they still have this access to sell NFTs. And when you buy their NFT, you know, you're actually helping them, you know, travel away out of Ukraine or put food on the table for their kids or move into a safer corner of the country, whatever the case might be. You know, like these are real world, you know, impacts on the ground that can happen. Or in Iran, you know, I bought an NFT from an Iranian American who had put out this beautiful video about ballet in Iran and the fact that ballet had basically been outlawed in Iran, and they had amazing ballet dancers who are still amazing to this day. You know, some of them actually were around when the Ayatollah or, you know, whoever took over, and it became outlawed, right? But now they've put together this beautiful NFT showcasing both young, you know, Iranian girls who are obviously not in Iran, but are, you know, ballet dancers, as well as those who were impacted directly by the outlawing of ballet, and telling their whole story, showing the beauty of their culture in a beautiful video on the blockchain as an NFT. And that's just an example, right? So when I buy that, I know I'm not only buying a beautiful piece of art, but I'm supporting that Iranian lady's mission to really raise awareness and to give back to these artists who are struggling now, right? So those are just two examples, but I think the environmental impact is one, but I think the social impact is another one, and you know, it's all part of the ESG kind of umbrella, right? And I'm just glad we were able to kind of speak to dispelling some of the myths around ESG, frankly, because there is a need for better social sustainability. There is a need for better environmental sustainability, and nobody can deny that. And I do think Web3 and NFTs, we've seen it, I know, you know, directly can help with social sustainability and environmental sustainability. Thank you. Really important point. And I think we've hit that home. So if people can take anything from this episode, it's the importance of sustainability and the fact that it is an ongoing struggle, and also the importance of representation. I think that was a really great point that you brought up, Tipi. And I think that it's an ongoing struggle, unfortunately. And even myself, you know, I don't even like the word ally, because I think we're all just humans and we should just, you know, be supporting other humans. So, but I do definitely, you know, like I said, my first NFT I ever minted, I thought that the toppling of the Queen statue, which still hasn't gone up, by the way, like 2-3 years later, which I support. Let's put up, you know, maybe an Indigenous leader. We have Louis Riel, but he's in the back of the legislature. You know, maybe we move him up to the front, get rid of the monarchy altogether. But, you know, we'll see what happens. But the point is, I just found that as a very impactful historical event that happened, you know. And so though I do not have Indigenous blood, I took it upon myself to go, you know, take pictures of that happening, put my own perspective of it on the blockchain, speaking to the, you know, pain and struggle and really horrible history of colonialism in Canada, but also putting it in that modern context of, you know, how are we making this better? How can we advocate and how can we support, you know, these young people who came out, expressed their frustration. Some of them maybe took it too far, but ultimately it was still a genuine, passionate display of let's change things, you know. And I hope that the lesson has come through. And I guess where I was going with that is I did feel a little bit of, like, to your point, you know, it's not necessarily my story to tell as far as the wrongdoing of colonialization and the situation impacting Indigenous Canadians. But at the same time, as a Canadian, as someone who wants to see things, you know, change for the better, I still felt it as a, you know, important story to tell from my own perspective. But I don't know what's the right way for someone like myself and for others who want to keep, you know, raising awareness and continue to, you know, give voice to everything you've just described, you know, outside of definitely, you know, raising voices like yours and other Indigenous voices directly, and putting them on stage and making sure that they are invited to anytime, you know, sustainability conversations are happening, social improvements conversations are happening. Definitely, you know, making sure we can have you front and center. But outside of that, you know, how does someone like myself who wants to use NFTs to raise awareness, what's the best way for us to kind of navigate and while still, you know, making sure we're respectful to Indigenous voices?
So one of the things that I think is really important is empathy and compassion. And I think to do that, it's a two-way, recognizing that it's forward-facing and inward-facing. And so by understanding who we are ourselves and giving power to ourselves, being kind and being brave to ourselves, we are being kind and being brave to other people. And so, like I said, this the very beginning of my journey was I kind of came into the space thinking I never want anybody to feel the way that I felt. And I don't think I'm an island unto myself. And I don't think the Indigenous Canadians and Americans and Latin Americans, and we're not islands. We have our own kind of experience, but it's all very similar. And so we have battles. My experience in Web3 was, I was talking to some different friends around the world, and understanding some things I would never experience with gunfire. I had one conversation with somebody. It was in a clubhouse room, and it was a conversation. We were just kind of hanging out. We called them work-alongs, and my friend was in Iraq, and we were just talking about weather. And we're like, oh, it's really hot there. I'm like, I'm a little popsicle in the north here. I'd never survive in the heat. I said, so what was the hottest day you've ever had? And he said, my friend Hader said, oh, the hottest day was actually one of my worst days ever. It was like 50 degrees. And he said his dad had a heart attack in the heat, and they were trying to get him to the hospital. And they were running between buildings and dodging bullets. And I was just like, it makes me pause. My life experience, has been full of all kinds of trauma, very real trauma, very real experiences. Most of it happened in my childhood, and I grew up. I literally had to grow up out of it and survive and put that in the past and keep it there. And my experience right now is something I've never experienced anything like my friend Hader did. What the experiences of our friends when there was the earthquake in Turkey, the experiences of our friends in Ukraine, the experience of hangings and beheading of Mahsa with our friends in Iran. There's just a lot. There's a lot going on. We think about our the communities in Africa with tribal. There's just a lot going on around the world, and I don't think that it's my. I really don't want people to. Okay, what I'm trying to say is, I think we owe it to ourselves to understand who we each are. We have to, I started a series and it was called Our Journeys Back Home. And back to the point about the truth and reconciliation and colonial impacts and impacts in general. I think one of the experiences that I had in this conversation of, now year 3 in Web3 talking to international communities is that everybody's experiencing something that I've never experienced either, but we're all coming from the same kind of vessel of being humans, very vulnerable, trying to survive a lot of different kinds of impacts, either just because we're seeing it, we're hearing about it, and there's a lot of empathetic souls out there that we, like as creatives, are trying to figure it all out, right? So some of us are like, holy moly, that's a lot. I've heard all kinds of different kinds of words I've never heard before. On social media, I heard things like trauma dumping. I'm like, if people are sharing their experiencing and you neutralize that by using a term called trauma dumping, I don't buy that. I don't buy that. I think that's a completely lack of empathy.
Right.
And I could understand people, we get flags. We're all pretty intelligent people. I give us all credit. But our journeys back home was, I think people need to understand who they are, where they come from. I do believe 100%. Actually, in this conversation with Trevor Jones yesterday, he was talking about in mental health and AI. So this might be a good segue to AI afterwards. Yeah. But and tipi-fi and my Indigenous futurism. Mm-hmm. But what he said yesterday, he's like, it's really interesting because he was talking about mental health, and he said, in hospitals, putting IKEA art on the walls isn't going to help communities and those ill communities, people that are ill in the hospital. It should be pictures of where they are from, like where their locations are. I thought that's really interesting. That's why I went up. also because literally he said he needed to hear something optimistic, and I'm a cheerful optimist. It's the only way I survived
Nice.
is by being a cheerful optimist. And so I went up and I shared that he was completely right on point about understanding where you're from. And so people, I think, are so displaced. Maybe the reason why, instead of being accusatory for me of just pointing a finger and saying, how come Canadians and Americans are like this mixing pot of different people that don't respect the Indigenous community, I would say that, you know, having a real understanding of who you are, where you come from. People, I think, are very sad. You look at and I said this in our TP Tuesdays, quite often we talked about the fact that there's a lot of, what do they call those homes? Palliative care. You know, we put our elders in communities, in community homes away from us. And that's a disconnect from our history and our lineage. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of apathy and disconnect from who you are, because you're willing to do that. And I could understand if there was medicinal reasons. You know, there's healthcare is a concern, but more often than not, it's not. It's just that people are too busy to really value.
Too busy. You don't want to have them living in their house, or it's difficult.
So it's not a judgment on people. I just think people need to know where they come from. Because if you don't know where you come from, you don't value that. Why would you value it from somebody coming from somebody else? So when you ask a question, what could people do better? I would say learn your culture, because culture is very important. It affects us in a lot of different ways. It's literally, they said this in a lot of different studies. We talked about the generational impact, but they say you have cultural trauma that can be passed through our DNA. And so why would we focus on just the trauma? If the trauma can be passed, so can the joy and the celebration and the dance and the music. And it's there. If I played a drum beat right now, if I played one of our drums, you know how many people would be close to tears? They would feel something, right? They would feel it. And people play bagpipes at funerals, and there's just things that are tied genetically to us. And I think joy is one of them, and so is trauma. And so you need to understand. You need to turn yourself inside, understand where you came from. And we are made up of the things that are in our sky and the ground and our water. And that's our Indigenous beliefs. We're literally made up of those things. That's ceremonies, the clan systems, all of that is tied to our land. We have portals to new universes. Literally, I saw those when I was doing my environmental impact assessment, being taken on a boat to ceremonial sites where there are doorways to another universe.
There you go.
Right there is my perfect segue to what is tipi-fi and Indigenous futurism.
Let's go. You got these beautiful tipi-fi NFTs on the screen right now. The ones on object.com specifically. And to your point also about kind of converging it with AI and artificial intelligence and GAN art, and really just it's a beautiful mashup. So yes, please share a little bit of the inspirations behind tipi-fi and how you pulled them together. Also the actual construction of them, because it's something else. Thank you.
Oh God, this is a lot. This is a lot of inside on my outside. Holy moly. Okay, so I took a little note of something, and I realized something today, and I didn't realize it before. But so when I was a kiddo, there was a lot of going back and forth from. I'm from a remote fly-in community called St. Teresa Point First Nation, which is remote fly-in or ice roads. Only northern people understand what ice roads are.
I'm familiar with St. Teresa Point and ice roads, but I have not had haven't been able to do it myself yet.
Yeah. I'm scared. I was like, no way. I did a food drive for my community. I was like, I'm going to have to drive across the ice road. I was terrified. But anyways, so my point is what was I going to say? Oh yeah. So in my childhood, there was a lot. Again, I talked about the impacts of the residential schools and on that generation growing up without proper parenting, because they were literally in schools and not being raised by families with love and nurture. So then they were of like extreme trauma and abuse of those residential schools, right? So my mom was that person. And so